3 months ago, someone took Nancy Guthrie from her home in Tucson, Arizona, and had a plan for everything that followed. That is not a dramatic characterization. That is the considered assessment of a former detective who reviewed the available evidence in the case this week and offered an analysis that reframes how this abduction should be understood. The kidnapper had a plan. That specific phrase matters. It distinguishes this crime from the category of impulsive acts that law enforcement handles with a very different set of tools and expectations. Planned abductions are different in kind, not just in degree, from crimes of opportunity. They require preparation. They require the selection of a specific victim and a specific time. They require the anticipation of law enforcement responses and the development of contingencies. And they typically involve a perpetrator who has thought through not just the crime itself, but its aftermath, including how to manage the family, how to manage the investigation, and how to sustain leverage over an extended period. Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 75 days. The person who took her is still communicating with her daughter. The most recent communication claimed she is alive and in Mexico. A former FBI agent who assessed the suspect this week used the phrase God complex to describe the psychological profile. A UCLA criminologist described a grim reality about the statistical picture at this stage of an abduction case. And the local agency managing the investigation is producing its own story, one centered on a social media post that triggered national outrage because it announced that a woman named Nancy had been located, and the public's reaction was entirely predictable given the context. This report examines what all of it means when held together rather than in separate pieces. The criminal psychology, the geographic claim, the forensic evidence, the behavioral pattern visible in how this case has unfolded over 11 weeks, and what the realistic range of outcomes looks like from where things stand today. To understand this case through the lens of criminal psychology, it helps to build a profile from the ground up using the information that is actually in the public record. Begin with the crime itself. Nancy Guthrie, 82 years old, was taken from her home in Tucson in what was classified as an abduction. The age and physical condition of the victim matters in a criminal psychology analysis. An 82-year-old woman is not a victim who presents a physical threat to a kidnapper. She is not someone who would be expected to resist effectively or to generate the kind of bystander response that younger, more physically capable victims sometimes produce. If you are constructing a kidnapping operation in which the physical execution needed to be relatively uncomplicated, selecting an elderly victim reduces one category of operational complexity. What remains in a kidnapping of this kind is the other complexity: the management of the family, the management of law enforcement, and the management of the extended operation over time. These are cognitive and psychological demands rather than physical ones. The person who planned this abduction was apparently more prepared for those demands than for anything involving physical resistance. The ransom note received early in the investigation established the financial frame. But the second communication, described as a taunt claiming Nancy Guthrie is alive in Mexico, does something different. It does not advance a financial objective. It does not move the case toward the resolution that a financially motivated kidnapper would be working toward. It demonstrates something about the sender's psychological relationship to the crime. The God complex assessment offered by a former FBI agent this week is the psychological framework that connects these pieces. In criminal psychology, the God complex describes a pattern of cognition in which an individual believes they are fundamentally exempt from the consequences that govern other people's behavior. This belief does not emerge from nowhere. It typically develops through a history of successful risk-taking, through experiences of evading consequences for behavior that should have produced them, or through a personality structure that fundamentally overestimates one's own capability and underestimates the capability of opposing forces. In a kidnapping context, someone operating with a God complex is a dangerous suspect for specific reasons. They do not experience fear of apprehension in the ordinary way. That fear is what typically causes perpetrators to conclude criminal operations before they are identified. Remove that fear or reduce it significantly, and you create a suspect who may continue to operate long past the point where self-preservation would have caused most people to stop. The extended timeline of the Nancy Guthrie case, 75 days and still communicating, is consistent with a perpetrator who does not experience that ordinary fear. The taunting note claiming Nancy is in Mexico is, in this psychological frame, not a strategic communication. It is a demonstration. The perpetrator is demonstrating that they have access to Savannah Guthrie, that they know how to reach her, that they are willing to cause her pain simply to demonstrate that they can. The Mexico claim may or may not be geographically accurate, but its purpose, from the sender's perspective, is to show that they are in control of the family's experience of this situation in ways that law enforcement cannot prevent. That is the profile the investigation is now working with. And it is a profile that is, in certain respects, more actionable than a purely unknown perpetrator, because it describes specific behavioral tendencies that can be tracked forward and backward through the available evidence. The geographic claim in the ransom note that Nancy Guthrie is alive and being held in Mexico is the most concrete new investigative lead in the case since the DNA hair evidence was flagged as potentially critical. Law enforcement must treat geographic claims and ransom communications with a specific kind of careful attention. Neither immediate dismissal nor immediate acceptance is the appropriate response. A geographic claim that is true represents an enormous investigative breakthrough, pointing resources toward a specific location and potentially enabling a rescue operation or a safe return negotiation. A geographic claim that is false represents an attempt to redirect investigative attention away from the perpetrator's actual location and toward a misdirection that serves the perpetrator's operational security. Determining which category the Mexico claim falls into requires active investigative work, international coordination with Mexican law enforcement, intelligence analysis of whether there are any known networks or individuals in Mexico with connections to the case, physical surveillance and intelligence gathering in the area the note might imply, and parallel forensic analysis of the note itself to determine what its physical characteristics tell investigators about where it was produced and how it was delivered. Police in Scottsdale addressed a related development this week, clarifying that something found or reported in that area does not confirm Nancy Guthrie's location. That clarification suggests investigators are managing multiple geographic threads simultaneously. Scottsdale is in the greater Phoenix metropolitan area, not far from Tucson. The relevance of Scottsdale to the case, whatever prompted the police clarification, suggests that the geographic picture of this investigation extends beyond the immediate Tucson area where Nancy Guthrie lived and was taken. A fourth detention near Tucson adds another geographic data point. The accumulation of investigative activity in and around Tucson suggests that despite the Mexico claim in the ransom note, investigators have reason to believe that persons relevant to the case are still in the Tucson area or have maintained connections to it. A planned kidnapping carried out by someone with ties to the area who subsequently claims the victim is in another country is a scenario that investigators will be testing against the available evidence. It is also a scenario consistent with the God complex profile, someone who believes they can make a geographic claim without consequence because they believe law enforcement cannot act on it effectively. The fourth detention is worth examining independently of the geographic question. 4 detentions in the course of an investigation represent 4 moments where investigative judgment produced enough evidence or suspicion to justify a formal detention. Not all of those detentions will have produced useful information, but each one is a moment of active investigative contact with someone in the universe of potential persons of interest. The cumulative effect of those contacts, even when individual detentions do not produce actionable results, is to narrow the field and refine the investigative picture. The FBI's DNA analysis, still ongoing at this point, may be the tool that provides definitive confirmation or elimination of one or more of the persons who have been detained. If the lab can produce a clean, matchable profile from the hair samples recovered at Nancy Guthrie's home, that profile can be tested against reference DNA from anyone who has been detained in connection with the case. A match would represent a decisive development. The Pima County Sheriff's Department provided an unintentional case study this week in how not to manage public communication during a high-profile active investigation. The department posted content stating that a woman named Nancy had been located. In the context of this case, with this department's prior communication history, with a national audience that has been following the story of a missing woman named Nancy Guthrie, the reaction to that post was entirely predictable. The public read it as what it appeared to say. Nancy Guthrie had been found. The woman located was Nancy Radakovich, 82 years old, identified and located in a completely separate situation that had no connection to the Guthrie investigation. The coincidence of names and the coincidence of age created a collision between a routine law enforcement notification and a nationally watched investigation that the department apparently did not anticipate. The language used in the public response tells a story about where the department's credibility currently stands. Tone deaf is the most common description, and it is precise. Tone deafness in communication means the inability to perceive how one's output will be received by the audience. A department that can post a located Nancy announcement in the middle of a national investigation about a missing Nancy without perceiving the obvious interpretation problem is demonstrating a level of awareness failure that goes beyond a simple mistake. The consequences of that failure extend beyond the immediate reaction. Every wave of public criticism directed at the Pima County Sheriff's Department during this investigation narrows the reservoir of credibility that the department has available for future communications. When the investigation eventually produces a significant development, whether that is an arrest, a confirmation of location, or another major turn in the case, the department will need to communicate it clearly and credibly. Each prior incident of communication failure makes that future credibility task harder. The God complex profile offered by the former FBI agent this week has an interesting resonance with the department's communication failures, though not in a way that connects the department to the crime. Rather, both the suspected perpetrator and the sheriff's department appear to share a relationship to consequences that is insufficiently calibrated. The perpetrator, in the psychological frame, does not adequately perceive the risk of their actions. The department does not adequately perceive the consequences of its communication choices. One of those situations is a criminal one. The other is an institutional one. But the underlying structure is similar enough to note. The internet's response to the Nancy Radakovich post generated its own secondary coverage that reached audiences who may not have been actively following the Guthrie case. In this way, the department's communication failure brought new attention to the investigation, though not the kind of attention that serves the investigation's goals. New audiences encountering the case through coverage of the sheriff's post are learning about it in a context of institutional criticism rather than investigative update, which shapes the frame through which they will subsequently follow the case. This week, if you have found this depth of analysis useful, please take a moment to subscribe so you can receive each update in this case as it arrives, because this case is generating new developments faster than any weekly summary can adequately cover. The human story at the center of this investigation has produced its own significant moments this week, and they deserve the careful attention they have not always received in the rush to cover the forensic and institutional developments. Savannah Guthrie departed her morning television broadcast mid-episode. The departure was visible, unplanned, and immediately interpreted by viewers who are aware of what she is living through. Whether the departure was connected to the investigation has not been confirmed by anyone with direct knowledge, but its visibility in the context of this case means that the interpretation, once assigned, is effectively impossible to retract. There is something worth dwelling on about the position Savannah Guthrie occupies in this case. She is simultaneously the daughter of a missing woman and one of the most publicly visible journalists in the country. Those two identities do not separate neatly in practice. Every morning that she appears on camera is a morning that her audience filters through their knowledge of what her family is experiencing. Every departure, every subtle emotional display, every moment where her professional composure encounters the reality she is living is observable and interpreted. She was described this week as subtly showing her true feelings regarding the ransom notes on air. That characterization is itself revealing. True feelings shown subtly imply that the feelings are real and present, even when professional discipline is containing them. The observer who noticed the subtlety is describing a moment where the containment became briefly incomplete, where what Savannah Guthrie was feeling about notes sent to taunt her, claiming her mother is alive in a country she cannot reach, became visible through the composed surface. The description of what Savannah Guthrie is experiencing as a campaign of terror is a characterization that appears in the reporting this week and that has specific criminal and psychological meaning. A campaign of terror in this context is a sustained pattern of deliberate actions designed to cause psychological harm to a specific individual. The pattern has all of the elements that characterization requires. It is sustained, it has continued for more than 10 weeks, it is deliberate, each communication requires active planning and execution, and it is targeted. The ransom notes are sent to Savannah Guthrie specifically, to a person who is publicly visible and whose response can be monitored. If investigators are approaching the communication in this case as a targeted psychological campaign against a specific person, rather than simply as ransom demands, it changes the investigative frame in ways that matter. Psychological campaigns, like physical crimes, leave evidence of the psychological needs they express. They reveal things about the perpetrator through what they choose to do and what they choose to say. And the God complex profile that emerges from this week's expert commentary is, in part, a product of analyzing those choices. A UCLA crime professor described a grim reality in their assessment of this case at 75 days. Dateline viewers described the case as making no sense, as feeling uncomfortable in ways that are hard to articulate. Former detectives describe weird details. Former FBI agents describe God complexes. These are not the descriptions that would emerge from a case that is following expected patterns and moving toward an expected resolution. This case is not following expected patterns, and the discomfort that generates in investigators, in observers, and in the family living through it is itself information about the kind of case this is. It is a case built by someone who planned it to be exactly this. Someone who anticipated that it would be extended, that it would be complicated, that it would resist the ordinary analytical frameworks, and who designed it that way deliberately. What undoes a plan of that sophistication ultimately is not a single dramatic breakthrough. It is the accumulation of evidence that no amount of planning can fully prevent. The hair in the FBI laboratory, the forensic characteristics of the ransom notes, the behavioral signatures visible across multiple communications, the connections between detained individuals and the evidential record of the crime. These are the things that planned crimes cannot fully erase, because planning a crime does not make the planner invisible. It makes them more deliberate. And deliberate people leave deliberate traces. Day 75 is not the end of this story. It is a chapter in a longer investigation that has not yet produced its defining development. When that development arrives, this report will cover it with the same depth and attention that this case deserves. There is a forensic dimension to the behavioral evidence in this case that has not been fully examined in standard coverage, and it connects directly to the criminal psychology framework built by the expert commentary this week. When investigators build a behavioral profile of a suspect in a case like this one, they are doing something more specific than generating a general description of a criminal type. They are constructing a set of predictions about how a specific individual behaves, what choices they make under pressure, how they communicate, what they are willing to risk, and where their psychology produces consistent patterns that can be matched about what is known about real people. The God complex assessment, combined with the observation that the kidnapper had a plan, produces specific behavioral predictions. A person with a God complex who planned this crime in advance will not respond to law enforcement pressure the way an ordinary suspect does. They will not become more cautious when they sense the investigation closing in. They may, in fact, become more active, more communicative, more demonstrative, because their psychology drives them toward action rather than concealment when they feel challenged. This prediction is testable against the behavioral record of the case. In the early weeks, the primary communication was the initial ransom note. As the investigation has extended, a second communication has arrived. More taunting in character, more geographically specific, more personally directed at Savannah Guthrie. That escalation from an opening demand to a personal taunt is consistent with the behavioral prediction that this perpetrator will escalate rather than retreat under pressure. If that prediction is correct, it has implications for what investigators should expect going forward. Additional communication is likely. That communication may become more specific in ways that inadvertently reveal information about the perpetrator's location, circumstances, or psychology. Every communication is also a forensic event. The God complex that drives escalation also drives the creation of evidence. The forensic work on the DNA samples in the FBI laboratory is separate from, but connected to, this behavioral analysis. If the DNA produces an identification, that identification can be tested against the behavioral profile. A suspect whose known history, psychology, and circumstances match the profile is a much stronger candidate for prosecution than one who matches only the physical evidence. Cases built on the convergence of forensic evidence and behavioral evidence are among the strongest that prosecutors can bring. The fourth detention near Tucson may be an attempt to test exactly that convergence. Each detained individual is assessed not just for whether they could physically have committed the crime, but for whether their psychology, circumstances, and behavioral history are consistent with the profile being built from the available evidence. A match on both dimensions is the investigative outcome that everything is working toward. The Mexico claim in the ransom note, meanwhile, has its own forensic value, regardless of whether it is geographically true. The claim tells investigators something about how the perpetrator thinks about law enforcement. Someone who puts a geographic claim in a ransom note either believes the claim is accurate and does not fear the investigative response, consistent with the God complex profile, or believes the claim is false, but that it will redirect resources in a way they can benefit from. Both readings tell investigators something about the suspect's assumptions about law enforcement capacity and their own safety. And assumptions can be wrong. When they are, they become the crack through which an investigation moves.